Hey everyone. So this week we've been focusing a lot on media literacy, about examining how we learn social constructs like race and gender and class and sexuality. And we've been paying special attention to the media in particular. It's not the only way that we learn social constructs, but it's one that's worth examining. And one example that I think is particularly pertinent to the content for this week, not just of social constructions, but of things like the propaganda model and this idea of anti-terrorism as a control mechanism. It's really important to kind of look at how something like the Middle East has been constructed in US media. And so this lecture is gonna kind of focus on that with particular attention to the portrayals of Muslim women in US media, in particular women living in Afghanistan. And so to start us off, I want to start with part of an address to the nation by Laura Bush in 2001. So this is former First Lady Laura Bush, wife of George W. Bush, who, after going to war in Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11, gave this speech to the nation about why we were at war and really trying to justify the U.S. presence in the Middle East during this time. And her speech made a lot of kind of interesting distinctions, such as making these divides between us, the civilized people throughout the world, and the Taliban, who wanted to impose their world on the rest of us. And she also did something else that was kind of interesting. She used the suffering of women and children in Afghanistan as justification for war. And she said, because of our recent military gains in much of Afghanistan, women are no longer imprisoned in their homes. They can listen to music and teach their daughters without fear or punishment. And the fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. And when Laila Abu Lughod in 2013 cited this passage in her book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving?, she kind of made the point that it really framed gender oppression in the Middle East as a cultural issue, that there's something about Islam and about the Middle East that is just inherently oppressive towards women, and that it assumed that it had always been that way until the US came in and guaranteed rights for women living in the region. And what that failed to do is, one, is it's not necessarily a cultural issue, it's a political and economic issue, and we'll explore what I mean by that in a second. But this idea that that's how it's always been in Afghanistan is not actually true, and we're going to discuss that a little bit more as well. But after this address, this really kind of became a popular narrative of the other in popular culture. And when I say the other, it just means constructing people of color in this case, or women of color more specifically, as someone other than us, and that other is inferior to us. And so you had all of these images and discourses in the media, such as this political cartoon here, that really kind of described Islam as inherently oppressive towards women, and women's decision to wear hijab or burqa as being a decision that was not their own, that they were forced to wear hijab or burqa, which is also really not the case. Women's decision to cover is a very complex process that is very much one that the woman herself makes. To a large extent, this is not the case in Afghanistan, but we'll explain how it got to be that way in a second. But this was really the dominant narrative of Muslim women and Islam in US media. And another thing that it did, it really kind of failed to look at women in Afghanistan in its full historical context. And so we're going to go through that here. So if we want to look at Afghanistan and the rise of Al-Qaeda, it's actually very important to begin in the 1970s and 80s during the U.S. Cold War. In April of 1978, Mohammad Daoud Khan, who's pictured on the left, was deposed and killed by army officers who supported the pro-Soviet People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA. At first, it was Army Colonel Abdul Qadir in the center who kind of took the place of the president. And then 3 days later, they elected civilian President Nur Muhammad Taraki to be president of Afghanistan. So in April 1978, Afghanistan came under a Communist Party rule in the middle of the Cold War. So Afghanistan is now seen as part of this sort of communist threat to America during this time. And also during this time, also in the 1970s, there was this resistance group that gave rise called the Mujahideen, which translates into Holy Wars. And in 1979, the Soviet Union, and they start fighting the PPDA. And in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, in their fight against the Mujahideen. And then in 1980, the CIA released an official report that the U.S. had begun funding the Mujahideen. They had begun funding this conservative Islamic party that was resisting this newly imposed PDPA party. However, even though it was their official report said that they began their involvement in 1980 after the Soviet Union invaded, it was actually the other way around. And in an interview with a French publication in 1998, Zbigniew Brzezinski gave an interview, and he was a national security advisor to President Carter during this time. And this is what he said. He said, according to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during 1980. That is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. But the reality, secretly guarded until now, is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. The day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter, we now have the opportunity of giving to the USSR its Vietnam War. So to give you an adjusted timeline, after 1978, with the deposition and assassination of Mohammad Daoud Khan, the rise of the conservative Islamic Mujahideen, it was actually in 1979, not 1980, that President Carter signs off on aid to the Mujahideen to combat the PDPA. And several months later of that same year, December 1979, then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So really what the CIA and the U.S. involvement was a strategy to draw USSR into a protracted war, to sow internal dissent and divert resources away from Russia, to make them kind of waste money on this war between these two groups. And so in the 1980s, and this is a photo of the Mujahideen in 1989, and the 1980s become kind of very important in this history. Reagan is elected president, and he embraces the Mujahideen. Remember, this is the conservative Islamic opposition, right? He calls them freedom fighters against the threat of communism. And the U.S. media really kind of uncritically accepted and disseminated this stance to the public that the Mujahideen were freedom fighters. And the U.S. offered both financial support, so sending the Mujahideen money, and they also offered technical support. So they would set up camps in which the Mujahideen members were armed and trained in military combat. So they were trained in U.S. military tactics. One notable alumni of the Mujahideen who was trained by the U.S. military during this time was actually Osama bin Laden. And he made connections in these camps that would allow him to form Al-Qaeda in the 1990s. So in total, the US put about $3 billion into support of the Mujahideen. And in 1989, the Soviet Union was defeated and left Afghanistan. And after lots of cleavages and kind of internal divisions, the Mujahideen broke up into several factions, one of which was the Taliban. And in 1996, the Taliban came to power. So prior to 1996, women had a life and a position in Afghanistan that's very different from what we know it today. They participated in the workforce and public life. The Afghanistan Constitution of 1964 recognized basic rights such as the right to vote and equal pay. Since the 1950s, girls had been allowed to attend school. Half of university students were women, and women made up about 40% of Afghanistan's doctors, 70% of its teachers, and 30% of its civil servants. And some women held positions of power, such as politicians and judges. And most women did not wear a burqa, which is the form of cover where you uncover your entire body and your face, though many wore hijab. And it was also not uncommon to see women dressed as you see them here. This is a photo of three Afghani women in the 1970s in Kabul. When the Taliban came into power, however, being part of the Mujahideen and this conservative group, they wanted women to remain in the domestic sphere. So in 1996, the Taliban implemented 4 central policies regarding women. They were forbidden to hold jobs. They could not attend school until the Taliban could develop an appropriate curriculum to prepare them for producing the next generation of Muslims. They had to wear burqas, and men had to wear what was called shalwar kameez, which means they had to maintain a beard and could not style their hair, and it was a particular form of clothing. And women could only leave their homes with a male relative and had to avoid contact with male strangers. And the U.S. Supported the Taliban in this and in these changes because they wanted to secure a contract for an oil pipeline through Afghanistan for a company called Unoco. And so in 2002, the war on terror, women kind of became this focal point to justify wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, focusing on women's oppression in Afghanistan and used women's oppression to kind of justify war in the area. But what there was no discussion of was how it was the history of U.S. involvement that created these conditions for Muslim women, that it was U.S. dollars, U.S. military intervention that facilitated the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan in the first place, and is the reason why women have the experiences that they do in Afghanistan today. And this is what Laila Abu-Lughod meant by her criticism of focusing on this issue as a cultural issue. To say that it's a cultural issue is to say that there's just something about Islam that's oppressive towards women, when in reality, what we're seeing in Afghanistan, women's experience in Afghanistan, is really an intersection of this history of U.S. involvement in a country for a war, its war with an entirely different country, the Soviet Union. And so as we kind of continue with this discussion of the U.S. media power and difference, I want you to think about how media can, one, be a powerful tool for change or a powerful tool for the status quo. Historically, media has been used to construct and reinforce this idea of an other, these other people who are inferior to us, in order to serve U.S. interests. However, it's also been historically used to shine a critical light on these interests and really educate the public about what's going on in the world. So when you're watching news reports or television shows or film or advertisements, it's important to kind of ask yourself, to what degree does this source normalize ism, so like normalizes racism or sexism or classism? To what degree does it challenge them? And is it in any way justifying dominance of one group or another, or is it challenging that? So with that, please let me know if you have any questions about this lecture or would like any more details about this, this particular topic. Thank you.